Welcome to all of our participants across the globe joining us today and those of you watching the recording. My name is Vijay and I am the UNICEF Global Focal Point on Children's Access to Justice. This is the first in a series of webinars co-hosted by UNICEF and the International Association of Youth and Family Judges and Magistrates. Today's webinar is focusing on the release of children from detention during COVID-19. The next webinar will be held on Thursday, the 21st of May at the same time, and that will be about sharing experiences on keeping courts operational for children and women during the pandemic. We hope you'll be able to join us, and we will share information about that webinar shortly. Some logistics for today's webinar. Today's webinar will involve questions to the panelists and their responses. They will not be presenting per se. However, we will provide links to presentations or publications that they have provided for you to be able to access. We are recording this webinar and it will be uploaded online, and we will share details of that. During this webinar, we won't be monitoring the chat. However, we will be taking your questions in the Q&A box, if you see at the bottom of your screen. And whilst we will try to address them as time permits, we will collect all of them to provide written responses. So let's begin. The COVID-19 pandemic has swept the globe into uncharted territory. With over 3.5 million cases and more than 250,000 deaths, the scale and the scope are mind-boggling. We often hear that the disease does not discriminate. However, it's worth contesting that assertion, both in terms of the disease and in terms of the devastating effect that prevention efforts are having. Children deprived of their liberty are at particular risk, especially those in criminal, administrative, national security, and military detention. As we know, detention makes it difficult to self-isolate or practice physical distancing, and more so in facilities that are overcrowded or unclean, or where security and the infrastructure impede access to water, sanitation, and basic hygiene. We also know that children in detention often have common demographic characteristics, with generally poorer health, more likely to have underlying psychosocial and mental health issues that are exacerbated by placement in custody. And whilst in detention, limited access to quality services. In response to this, and championed by civil society organizations and the UN, calls have been made internationally and nationally for the release of children. Globally, we are seeing children being released, but not nearly in the same numbers as other detainees. However, we know of approximately 26 countries across the world where children have been or are being released. So today's webinar is to share experiences of how some countries have successfully or otherwise managed the release of children from detention in response to the pandemic. We have some very distinguished panelists joining us today, and I'm going to step us through and ask them to introduce themselves and their organization. So let's begin with Anne-Catherine.
Hello, everybody. My name is Anne-Catherine Hatt, and I'm a prosecutor in juvenile matters in Switzerland. I have been working in this field for nearly 20 years now. After having worked as a prosecutor specialized on gender crimes and crimes against children, I switched over to juvenile crimes. In 2003, I did a sabbatical and worked for 6 months at the Criminal Court of Sierra Leone, investigating in the field of abusing children as child soldiers. I have a master's in law and in child rights. At this occasion, I would like to thank UNICEF for organizing this webinar in cooperation with AIMJF, of which I am also a board member. I think it is a good occasion to bring in the expertise of our members, who are all practitioners in the field of children's rights and children involved in judicial proceedings. As far as today's topic is concerned, my personal experience concerning the issue of children in detention during COVID-19 is that it has been a positive experience in regard of that the use of detention should be a very last measure of a resort.
Thank you so much, Anne-Catherine. And now let me hand over to Pak Slamet, who's joining us from Indonesia.
Good morning and good evening, Indonesia. My name is Slamet Prihandara. I am Director of Social Guidance and Juvenile Treatment, Directorate General of Correction, Ministry of Law and Human Rights of Indonesia. I have been working for correctional institution for 13 years. 13 years. Taking care of juvenile prison, part of my job. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pak Slamet. And now let me hand over to Judge Marta Pascual from Argentina.
Hello, good morning, everybody. Good morning in my country in South America. I'm Martha from Latin America. I live in Argentina. For those who don't know, Argentina is the very last country at the end of the American continent. I am also a judge, a juvenile judge, sitting every day in court, celebrating trial for small theft or small crimes, and for those very serious ones, as the South American continent now is involved in many crimes. So they are trying to see how to handle or what to do with this youngster. And I'm here also as I'm the president of the International Association of Magistrates and Judges of Family and Juvenile. That is a very old organization. So it was founded in 1928. And it's integrated with judges and also researchers and professors. There's a group of people that we deal and we try to see and to get good ways to deal with family and adolescent cases. And I'm very pleased to be here. So I want to thank, as my colleague, to UNICEF in the person of Vichy for this real good event and for sharing good ideas or trying to get a better way to work with our kids. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Judge Pascual. And now let me hand over to Michael Dempsey.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone, or good day, depending upon where you are. My name is Michael Dempsey. I'm the Executive Director for the Council of Juvenile Justice Administrators here in the United States. CJJA is a national nonprofit organization. Our members are made up of all 50 state juvenile justice system leaders across the country. We also have juvenile justice administrators, directors from about 15 of our larger cities and locally run juvenile detention probation department systems as well. And we've been in existence since about 1994, so about 25 years. And we work to bring those juvenile justice system leaders education, training, resources, in order to help them improve their juvenile justice systems, but also reduce the incidence of violence, reduce the use of isolation. We focus on reducing length of stay and ensuring that only those kids who truly need to be placed in secure settings are committed to those types of facilities. And we also work to improve community-based services.
Thank you so much, Mike.
Sure.
And last but not least, we're very lucky to have Hernan Carvante Martinez joining us. Over to you, Hernan.
Awesome. Thank you, Vijay. So hi, everyone. Hola, everyone. My name is Hernan Carvente Martinez. I am the Youth Partnership Strategist at the Youth First Initiative, and we're a national campaign as well here in the United States that focuses on building campaigns that want to close youth prisons and reinvest that money into community alternatives. I've been in this work for about 11 years. 4 of those 11 years were actually spent incarcerated in a juvenile facility in New York, one of the 50 states in the United States. And the last 8 years have been spent doing a variety of different roles, both from working in policy and research to now working in community organizing and really working directly with young people who have been released from prisons, as well as families who've been directly impacted by the justice system here in the United States. Most of our work at Youth First focuses on really empowering directly impacted people, on leading these campaigns to close youth prisons. We don't believe that incarceration at all should sometimes be used, sometimes even as a last resort, that we need to reimagine a world where prisons aren't even a solution, where they're not even an answer. And I think that this particular conversation, I'm really glad to be a part of, because that's been a conversation that we've been engaged in here in the United States, but I'm really excited to learn what other countries have done, and really just call out my own country, right? The United States, where the leader in incarceration, 2.3 million incarcerated, 43,000 of those are young people here in the United States. So we have the savage practice of locking up young people, and it's not right. But you know, I'll get more into that later. I just want to thank specifically UNICEF for the statement that was put out that directly highlighted the need to release young people from detentions and prisons around the world. I think that really provided more larger context, not just for the US, but globally, the need for us to really remove young people from these institutionalized settings. And AIMJF as well, thank you for co-hosting this and welcoming me into this conversation.
Thank you so much, Hernan. So let's dive in. The first question I'm going to pose to some of the panelists is if they could briefly describe the measures taken by your country to release children from detention in response to COVID-19. So let's hear firstly from Judge Pascual from Argentina.
Okay. So the first thing that we did with this pandemic that shocked all of us is to look through all the files of the youngsters that were deprived of liberty. It means they were in locked places. Is to go to 2 topics. The first one were the health problems. So there we found some boys. Whenever I talk about boys because we don't have girls deprived liberty. They are with other social measures or alternative measures or other kind, being in other places but not locked. So we found that some have pneumonia, asthma, AIDS, and we found a very different case that one was boy that his spleen has been extracted. So I have to ask some doctors, medicine doctors, if this was serious because he was locked because of a murder. So, and they said me that it was serious because the spleen is an organ that is like a filter for the viruses. So we have to be careful with that case. And the other topic was that those youngsters that were close to getting a benefit. So in that cases, what we did is we just invent, because it's not in our codes, penal codes, home detention. It means that we look through the family and we found some, it may be grandmother, father, some relative, or it can be some member of the civil society, that can take this boy to their houses and take care of him. And we talk by Zoom with the boy, telling him that this measure means that he couldn't go out of the house without permission. And we asked the family of the person that took charge of the boy that they have to supervise it. And we opened a phone, a duty official phone, that they have to call to the court, to a referent. We divided the files between the people that works in the court. If anything happen, it means if the boy leaves the premises, gets in trouble, or established by phone a bad relationship with the group, who's used drug, among others. And that the person that took care of him will be responsible, if it was one member of the family, for not calling or not to tell us that the measure has been broken, and they will be, if they were family, responsible to be liable or to be imposed a fine. So we had good results with it, just except two exceptions that were small ones. One boy that the grandmother phoned me and said, Marta, the ball in the night went out, so he went to take him back to the house. And when I talked to him by phone, he said, well, I was missing my baby because he had a baby when he was in jail. So I want to tell all of you, to share with you to a positive way and a negative of this one. The negative side is that due to this global pandemic, all the imprisonments had been revised, and the media took this new in a very imposing fear to the community. So what we had, luckily now they've stopped, we have the population express their fear, heating pans in balconies in front of their houses or windows as a way to protest against the judge's measure. But my thought, and among other colleagues, is because the media, as they used to do, or to doing when a boy or a girl committed a crime, the yellow press, trying to get fear to the population and saying that we have revolving doors, and all these kids and adults, they were focused more in adults, but they were all involved in the same case because they were fear of the lack of security. But the positive side is we didn't have problems with the youngsters that had been released, and they are in their homes or in the houses having or doing what we have imposed them, and following their school classes or their trainees at home. So it was good, and it's good, a good measure to continue, that when we go through all these cases, although they committed serious crime, sometimes we have to be a little more, we'll be careful, because we can try another, as the Convention of the Children say, that it has to be the last resource to lock children. Okay, that's all.
Thank you so much, Judge Pascual. I might hand over now to Mike Dempsey from the US about some of the measures taken here in the US. Mike, over to you.
Okay, thank you, sir. One thing I want to just quickly mention is that CJJA recently released a COVID-19 issue brief, and that issue brief was developed as a result of numerous calls that we conducted with juvenile justice system directors from all across the country. I think we had approximately 37 state level and local level system directors that were involved in putting together the information, and it just kind of compiles the various responses from different jurisdictions that you know may find useful. So I think if you go to cjja.net, and there'll be a red tab up at the top of our page that I think it says COVID-19 responses. If you click on that, it'll take you to various resources that we've made available on our website. So in responding to this particular question, I think here in the United States, we saw a couple of different strategies that kind of unfolded naturally, I think. One of those was the result of reduced intakes or commitments to juvenile justice detention and long-term deep end commitment facilities. And part of that decline in commitments was a result of the courts themselves suspending hearings, particularly for those lower level offenses and crimes, and moving to only conduct emergency hearings for severe public safety risk cases. They also ceased hearings on what we refer to as technical violations, so kids who are in the community on probation or on parole under any type of supervision, who may have violated some type of rule or regulation of their supervision. Those types of cases have been suspended as well. So those things have greatly impacted the number of kids coming into the system themselves. The other thing that we saw take place was facilities that were holding kids, doing a very quick review of their current populations, identifying those kids who are lower risk, those kids who had already had re-entry processes in place or re-entry placement in place or approved, and identifying those kids and expediting those releases as quickly as possible, moving those kids back out into the community. As a result of that, I think we have seen a very significant reduction in the overall population levels of our secure facilities. So the interesting thing here in the United States is we don't have any one juvenile justice system that is similar, really. They all kind of operate independently, and they have various rules and regulations. Some jurisdictions have release authority themselves, so kids who are committed to what we would say is a deep end secure correctional style facility, some jurisdictions have release authority, and they could identify kids immediately who they could return back out into the community. Other jurisdictions, the courts actually maintain release authority. So in those situations, some of the jurisdictions had to involve the courts themselves, hold emergency hearings in order to process some of those kids for expedited release.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Mike. I'm now going to move us over to Indonesia, to Pak Slamet, so that he can respond to this first question. Over to you, Pak Slamet.
Thank you, Wijaya. Director General of Correction of the Ministry of Law and Human Rights is responsible in providing policy direction, technical support, monitoring, and supervision of correctional facility, including juvenile prisons. There are 34 juvenile prisons, of which 16 are located in the same compound with adult prisons. Most of the correctional institutions in Indonesia are overcrowded, including facilities where juvenile are imprisoned. We understand the importance of holding public health concerns, including by preventing COVID-19 in closed institutions such as prison, and ensuring the safety and health of juvenile staff and community members. Immediately after the President of the Republic of Indonesia adopted large-scale social distancing policy, which include working, learning, and worshiping from home, the Minister of Law and Human Rights adopted several policies, including on assimilation and integration of prisoner and juvenile prisoners. The policies were adopted as prevention and response measure COVID-19. Before the COVID-19 pandemic, and mates, including juvenile who are entitled to assimilation, can interact with others, including visitor, but in the correctional facility and under monitoring. In the COVID-19 policy, assimilation process is implemented by returning the juvenile to their families, but they are restricted to stay at home. In addition to good conduct, active participation in correctional programs, the juvenile is entitled and can be released to assimilation if he or she is served in prison at least 3 months. The juvenile entitled for integration if he or she has served at least half of the imprisonment sentence period. On the day of March 2020, when the assimilation and integration policy was adopted, there were 2,796 juvenile in various correctional facilities. There were 1,171 juvenile entitled for assimilation and integration, for around 42% of the total number of juvenile in prisons. They have been released to assimilation and integration processes. It should be understood that the policy and assimilation and reintegration adopted by the ministry is part of number of policies that overall become comprehensive policies to prevent and respond to COVID-19 in correction facility. Other policies include adjustment of services, such as limiting face-to-face interaction, restriction of visit, while supporting phone and online communication with families. The COVID-19 policies and program also include improvement of water, sanitation, and hygiene facilities, as well as health screening and services. With the implementation of large-scale social distance, the minister adopts a guidance line for online community inquiry, supervision, and monitoring of prisoners and juvenile prisoners who are undergoing of assimilation and integration. The guidance provides direction to parole and probation officer in working during COVID-19 pandemic. In addition to that, the heading of children who are undergoing assimilation and integration is also guided by an intersectoral protocol established by the National Task Force on COVID-19. This is a task force established and opened by the President, involving various ministers, including the Minister of Women Empowerment and Child Protection and Minister of Social Affairs. It is chaired by the head of National Disaster Management agency. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pak Slamet. So we've heard some interesting experiences from a few different jurisdictions. I wanted to bring in Hernan here for him to, if you could briefly share your story and the experience of being in detention, because I think it's important to frame these discussions and experiences that we're talking about today from the lived experience of children. Over to you, Hernan.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you to the previous panelists for all the examples that you all have shared. So yeah, I'm gonna bring it to a little bit of the personal. So I mentioned at the start of this webinar that I spent some time incarcerated in New York State, which is one of the 50 states in the United States. And I went in to the justice system at the age of 16 for the crime of attempted murder. And in New York at the time, which was in June of 2008, we still tried 16-year-olds as adults. That no longer is the case at this time. But at that time, we were actively still engaging in the practice of treating young people age 16 as adults here in the US. And so I want to make that clear, right? That like during that time, New York was one of 2 states that actively was doing that practice. And I was fortunate in that my crime happened 2 days before I turned 16. And so I ended up being tried under the juvenile offender law here in New York, which categorized me in a particular group of young people who committed a violent felony, but ultimately was going to be tried and sentenced to a juvenile placement, and essentially keeping me away from the adult system. And at the time of my incarceration, you know, I was a soon-to-be father. So what Marta Pascual mentioned earlier about the young person who had a kid, like that was my reality at that time. I was soon to be a father and had just gotten incarcerated. I came into the justice system with a gang affiliation, drug addiction, severe anger issues. I was definitely not the person that you've gotten to know, VJ, or that the rest of the panelists have gotten to know, someone who's really calm, who really is here to advocate on behalf of young people. I was a completely different person back in 2008. I was someone who had lost hope in himself, had lost hope in systems, had lost hope in his family, and essentially had lost hope in that my community had given up on me. And so at the time of my incarceration, I experienced a number of sort of identity shifts, right? I went from wanting to be a gang member to no longer wanting to be a gang member, wanting to be the best father, but not knowing how to be a father, not, you know, trying to really figure out what was the thing that I wanted to do with my life. And I mentioned these sort of buckets of my identity because that's what young people in facilities across the United States, but also around the globe, you know, have, right? They're parts, and they don't just, you know, they're not just their story that led them into the justice system. They're not just the crime that led them into the justice system. They are very much someone's son, someone's possible father, and ultimately someone who is capable of change. When I was here in New York, I went through 3 juvenile detention centers: Spofford Juvenile Facility Detention, Crossroads Juvenile Detention, and Horizons Juvenile Detention. And all of these were the sort of entrance into the justice system here in New York. And Spofford has since closed. It was one of the worst juvenile facilities here in New York City. After I was sentenced 2 to 6 years for the crime of attempted murder, I was sent to upstate New York to another facility called Brookwood Secure Center to serve out my time. While I was there, I actually, the one experience that I've been bringing up a lot more in conversations here in the US was the time when we had Hurricane Irene hitting the eastern coast of the United States. And just the fear of knowing that I was caught in a facility without the ability to walk out or just run, you know, in case the damage was so destructive that this facility was affected, drove many of my peers and myself to the brink of really bad reactions, right? Where we wanted to actively fight our way out or just engage in really destructive behavior because we were afraid, you know, we were scared. And I think back to that moment and related to this situation that we're in now and try to picture 17-year-old, 18-year-old Hernan at Brookwood and what would Hernan have done in that moment. First and foremost, I don't think I would be as calm as I am now. I would actively be afraid for my life. Hearing that facilities across the United States have not provided young people with masks, with gloves, or all the proper sanitary equipment, I would probably have been losing my mind with that too, right? Like, I don't have anything to keep myself safe. And the fact that facilities across the US have also canceled recreation, educational services, in-person family visitation, and everything that essentially kept me at least safe and grounded while I was in a facility setting would have just driven me up the wall at that point, right? Like, as a young person, we need connection, we need the opportunity to be loved, we need the opportunity to really make changes in our lives that maybe we couldn't do while we were in the community. And I don't believe Brookwood at the time was the solution for that, right? I think the one thing that turned my life around was a gentleman by the name of James LeCain, who was like the first person to see me beyond the attempted murder kid, beyond the gang affiliation, beyond the drug addiction, beyond the anger issues. He was the first person to see me as what I was, a young person who had experienced a lot of trauma, who has experienced a lot of pain, who needed to heal, who needed to transform, and needed to be provided with an array of opportunities. And although he created a space in the facility that I was in to really offer me those opportunities, one of the things that I actively say now is that it shouldn't have taken me going to prison to get all that support, right? It shouldn't have taken me going into an institutionalized setting for people to know that I was crying out for help, that I needed help, that my drug addiction, that my anger issues weren't me just trying to be rebellious or weren't me trying to be problematic. They were me actively saying, I don't know how to communicate my emotions, but in this way, because this is the way that I get attention. And so I want to highlight that, right? That not just here in the US, but globally, I can't imagine young people being in detention centers, in military camps, or wherever they're being held at this moment, not being afraid for their lives in the middle of a global pandemic where the numbers around the globe continue to increase in terms of how many people are dying. And although young people haven't been the highest reported cases, they are still very much a vulnerable population, right? They're in facilities, they have nowhere to go. And my experience here in the US with facilities is that, again, they are not the cleanest spaces, they are not the safest, and they are also not breeding grounds for positivity. They are very much, though, breeding grounds for death with this virus. And so I want to end by saying that part of what brought me into the justice system was the crime of attempted murder. I do not want to shy away from the fact that that was a serious crime, that was a violent crime. I think part of what is important for me to highlight about that experience is that I was very much a product of my environment. I was very much a product of anger and issues that were happening in my community, but also generations of trauma here in the US. For those of you who don't know, we still haven't recovered from the slavery period that existed here in the US. We haven't recovered from a number of other structural racism things that we've been implemented against people who look like me, who are brown like me, or who are of darker skin color than me. And so, as Mike mentioned earlier, there have been some active things that states have done in the United States to pivot away from this practice and to try to halt detention, get as many young people as possible, but we haven't done enough. And so today, the Youth First Initiative is releasing a report titled "States Must Do More to Protect Youth Behind Bars During COVID-19." I will be sharing that with you later today, Vijay, so that you can share that with everybody who's been on this conversation. But yeah, as we continue to think about how we keep having these conversations, I just want to honor all the young people who are currently behind bars who don't have a voice. It's great to have a bunch of panelists with expertise, judges, people who run systems or who have experience with working with people who run systems. But we should have more young people in these conversations as well. We need to let the young people tell us what they need right now. We need to let them speak out, and we also need to give them a space to guide us into what the solutions are that don't involve prison, because I don't believe that that's the only solution that we have, and we have a lot more power, not just here in the US, but around the world to do more for our young people. They deserve more.
Thank you so much, Hernan, for sharing your story, and also that really bringing that perspective to all our panelists. I'm going to move to Anne-Catherine. The experience in Switzerland has been slightly different to many countries, other countries, in that there hasn't been a specific release of children from detention. Can you explain why that is? And then also some of the measures Switzerland has been taking in terms of limiting new admissions to detention. Over to you.
Okay, so first of all, I would like to thank Hernan for this very impressive statement that was very personal, and I really hope that the minors I have to deal with, that they see me as the person that you mentioned, who look at the personality of the juvenile and is interested in them and tries to find the best solution, because this is how I understand my job. So I think we are in a very privileged situation in Switzerland, because in Switzerland, detention is not a very big issue. I would like to first of all make a short comment about the Swiss Juveniles justice system, that you can a bit understand how it works here. In Switzerland, most of the juvenile crimes are dealt by the prosecutor, so me and my colleagues. He leads the investigations, he closes the cases in 90% by a summary penalty order that he issues, and he monitors the execution of his orders. So we do the full range with the minors. We have to look at their cases and we follow them even after their sanctions. So we get a very intense relationship over many years sometimes. The juvenile justice system here is a dualistic system, so where the prosecutor sanctions the juvenile who committed a crime, but he also arranges child protection measures if the child needs it. Besides different other measures, the child can be placed in open or closed education facilities, which I would say here, at least the closed ones must be seen also as a kind of deprivation of liberty, of course. If you look at the numbers in 2019, out of a population of 1.7 million minors in Switzerland, 480 children were placed in prison or in institutions at a certain date where they made the research. Out of these 480, only 50 were in pre-trial detention or in prison sanctions. And I would like to add here that the pre-trial detention in Switzerland, in probably 95% of the cases, it lasts only 2 days. So it's really a very short action. And prison sanctions, the maximum penalty for minors in Switzerland is, in most of the cases, 1 year of imprisonment, 4 years in very severe cases. So that shows that detention isn't a really very important issue in Switzerland compared to other countries. So from these 480 other children that were placed in institutions, 130 of them were in closed institutions. That I would also look at the deprivation of liberty, same impact on the child probably. And the other 300 were in open institution. So you see that the numbers of classical detentions, how would I mention it, with 50 is very, very low in Switzerland. During Corona in Switzerland, the number of these detentions would be even much lower. Prosecutor in juvenile matters who would only order detentions, they would only order detentions on national security grounds. So we try to reduce the amount even more than it is usually applied. This in respect to the health and the well-being of the child on one side, but also of the people who have to deal with this juvenile, like police officers and employees of the detention centers. During the Corona lockdown, courts, magistrates, and police members worked, if possible, in home office, and hearings would only be held in absolutely important, if they were absolutely important. And due to that fact, investigations, trials, of course, will take more time. And this was a reason we also kept in mind, so we really tried to avoid pretrial detentions wherever we could. The situation in education facilities were a bit different. So I'm talking about those closed and open institutions. Many institutions in Switzerland did not accept new entries during the Corona lockdown for reasons of to take care of the children who were already placed there, and also, of course, in regard of their employees. On the other hand, those who did take new entries, they felt a big demand, and this especially by child protection agencies, for placement of children who suffered of violence in their families due to the governmental directions on Corona, which said you should have to stay home. And of course, also of the consequence that many people lost their jobs in Switzerland, the insecurity, which caused a lot of stress in the families. Those children who were placed in institutions were, of course, also affected by the consequences of the Corona pandemic. The lockdown in Switzerland started shortly before spring break. With that, all the weekends at home and holidays were cancelled for the kids. Visits from family and friends were not possible anymore. The first reaction of some of the juveniles, the ones who were placed in open institutions, were some of them just run away. But they quickly realized that outside the institution there was no social life anymore, as everything was shut down. So they came back on their own, or they were brought back by the police, where they had to undergo a self-isolation of 5 days. After that, they were free to move around on the compound of the institution. To compensate the fact that they were not able to leave the place, the institutions organized a lot of activities on the ground, and the contact to their families was kept by video calls and more phone time as usual. If an ordinary exit from their stay in the institution was already planned before the reactions of the government on Corona, so the juveniles were able to finish their stay as planned. So they would release them as it was planned. But to prepare their exit and find a good solution for the time off, they could also leave the institution for job interviews and even internships. These had to be well planned, as well as their return back to the institutions to safeguard the well-being of the children still in the institution. So usually they also had to undergo a self-isolation when they came back to the institutions. As they told me, it was the 5 days that they would do for every child who was outside and came back to an institution. So to summarize the situation in Switzerland during COVID-19, I can say that there have been less children in detention, and for the children who were already placed in education facilities, they had restrictions which the institutions tried to compensate with other activities. But the duration of their stay and their ordinary exit was not affected by or extended by the COVID-19 pandemic.
Thank you so much, Anne-Catherine. Next, I'm going to hand to Judge Pascual and to Mike Dempsey as well to highlight just one challenge, because of time, that your country has faced in the release of children and how you overcame that particular challenge. So over to you, Judge Marta, if you could share just one challenge, that would be great.
Yes, I think for us, for the judges, the challenge should be to show to prosecutors that the measures that we have taken, and I forgot to tell that in these measures we take into account the victims. So these kids or these youngsters that were released, the measure or the way the house where they have to stay, it has to be far away or not near the victims, because we take into account their voice and that they don't want to have them near the houses. And I think that our challenge will be to show to prosecutors that in Argentina or in most in South America want to incarcerate juveniles, that and I have some questions in here, which are the measures, and who are going to follow the measures, that it has to be social workers, and it's important an interdisciplinary team to go through the roots of this kid, what happened to be so cruel or to have done what he did. So our challenge should be to show that the incarceration of this youngster is not good, that we have to go through other pedagogical education and measure, and it's very important to be close to these youngsters, because they need a supervision, and when you trust on them, many of the times they will follow the measures. So that will be to show that incarceration is not a way, and in my society, to prevent delinquency or security.
Okay, thank you. So recognizing the time, this was a really tough question for me, and I've been thinking about it for a couple of days now. Obviously, to me, the primary importance has been focused on, making sure that we're keeping staff and kids healthy and well, and keeping or working to minimize exposure risks as best we possibly can. And recognizing that along that path, we have had an increase in fear for safety concerns from both the staff and the kids, and being responsive to those fears, being responsive to the increased needs around those types of concerns has been probably one of the more challenging aspects of working through the COVID, and making sure that that response isn't isn't overly restrictive as far as maintaining having an increase in room confinement and isolation. I mean, that's one of the things that we wanted to really work hard here in the United States in reducing over the course of the last several years, is a focus on recognizing those needs. So implementing social distancing practices within a facility setting, while also trying to maintain facility operations, program education, and other types of activities and services, while working to keep people healthy and safe is extremely challenging. The other thing that I would say real quickly is just the overall need for, well, we had this increased heightened awareness and focus on reducing population levels and releasing and expediting releases of children from secure facilities. We have to also recognize that there is also an inherent responsibility to ensure public safety when we do that. So I think that was also a very heightened awareness around that issue as well, because the last thing we want to do is release kids into unsafe or unhealthy placement environments back into the community, right? I think we have an obligation to make sure that we're releasing kids to safe environments when we do that.
Thank you so much, Mike and Judge Pascual. And to our participants, we note that you are providing a lot of questions, and we're taking note of them and trying to answer them in these questions, as well as offline. We will provide written answers. So the next question I'd like to pass to Indonesia and Pak Slamet, and also Hernan. And if you could share one concrete example related to the rights of children who remain in detention under COVID-19 restrictions. We've been talking a lot about releasing children. What about those children who have not been released? So perhaps just one concrete example, given the time, about good practice for this. So firstly, over to Pak Slamet in Indonesia. Please go ahead.
As previously mentioned, the police and release and integration is only one of the policies adopted to prevent and respond to COVID-19 pandemic. The Director of Correction of the Ministry of Law and Human Rights also adopted policies balancing public health concern while fulfilling the right of prisoners, particularly juvenile prisoners. We limit visit by the families, but we also support the children to call or video call with their families using facilities provided by the Juvenile Correctional Center with part stricter measure for the staff who continue working, coming back and forth from their home to the facilities. And we do have check to minimize infection to children and or the staff. Frequency of health services increases, and we collaborated with local department of health to support the children, including with vitamin in improve their immune system. In some cases, our warden take over a tutor to ensure education for the children continue.
Thank you so much, Pak Slamet. Hernan, I wonder if you can pick up on this. You highlighted some issues children face in detention in your first answer. I wonder if you could also share some thoughts on this question.
Thank you. Yeah, like I don't know if you gave us the questions intentionally. I think I'm struggling with finding the positive in a lot of the stuff happening in the United States. There's nothing positive about having kids locked up. I just want to be very clear about that. I do think that one of the things that is happening for young people who are currently incarcerated is, and I think Mike touched on this a little bit in his initial remarks, that it is forcing juvenile justice agencies, court systems, and all juvenile justice actors in the United States to look very closely, case by case, what situations young people are in currently, and determine whether or not some of those young people should be released. And so it's forcing the United States to take a closer look at young people who are currently sitting in detention. This pandemic is forcing that sort of immediate micro lens into whether or not a young person should even be in a facility setting at this point. I think one of the immediate things that is happening, we're also now reducing the number so much that we're focusing very much now on, like, what about the kid that nobody wants to talk about? What about the kid like Hernan who committed murder, attempted murder, robbery in the first degree, the crimes that people here in the US immediately criminalize, or as Marta Pascual said, you know, who the media immediately jumps on and says, this is a threat to public safety. I do think that the positive, the concrete example is that, even though it's not very specific, it's the very broad need for us as the US to rethink our use of incarceration, for us to rethink the ways in which young people currently are sitting in detention centers, and ultimately the use of prisons in general, right? Like whether or not we have outlasted our use of incarceration here in the US, and the need for us to move into that community alternative conversation that is rooted in making sure that the next step is focusing on kids who have been charged for the most serious crimes, and making sure that we're not putting them in a prison, but that we're holding them in the most supportive, healing-centered space that also upholds accountability in a very positive way. Not in the lens of, I want to be very cautious, the public safety lens here in the US is lock them up and that's public safety for some. So I want to be very clear, that's not what I'm saying about public safety. I'm very clear about, we need to help young people heal. We need to honor the survivors, the people who've been harmed by crimes as well. But we also actively need to find a real blend of that. And I think this pandemic has forced the US to really take a close look at that. And I think it's going to force us to make a very concrete decision moving forward on what we're going to do for children here in the US.
Thanks so much for that, Hernan. It is a nice segue into our last question. So thank you very much. And as I said at the outset, the pandemic has taken us into uncharted territory, with many countries learning as they go, including in the justice sector. And this has been challenging, but it has also highlighted, as Hernan and others have pointed out, ways of doing things differently. In fact, many jurisdictions that had strong diversion and alternatives to detention for children were ahead of the game when the pandemic hit, as we heard from Switzerland and some states in the US. So my final question to each of you is, how can we ensure that after the pandemic has passed, that we do not lose the gains that we have achieved in the release of children? So let's start with Judge Pascual from Argentina. Over to you. Welcome.
Sorry.
Please.
Yeah, I was saying that it's a very difficult question because I think everybody is wondering what would happen in new times about taking care of the earth, and we all are very. I would say we all think that we would like to have a new world with new premises and new ways of thinking. My personal idea is that we have to argue politicians to focus on children and to focus on juvenile, because these are the future citizens. So we need to point at them and to try to get a better society for them. I think that when the kids or when the juvenile come to the courts, it's difficult because they had been seriously injured and some of them had committed very serious crime, and the society wants very large sentence for them. But I think that we have to try to think to invest in prevention in this area, these tough areas, these I call red zones, where we have a lot of problems. But also we have to share and to compare what happened with this, and I think that UNICEF and our association has some good points to focus. Is what are the final results of the kids that are incarcerated, and what about, and we have very few cases of coming again, no? What is as you said, Vijay, to look at other measures, no? We should say preventive measures, to follow them and to send to, perhaps to take them away from the places where they have developed their lives, and to think in all these measures that don't mean close them in this institution. And another point that I want to focus is that those kids in my country, that we have some boys that have to spend years in these places, is to think that they had a double deprivation of liberty, because they were in this closed institution and also without basic sport education, so that the judges or the ones who have to go through those measures have to take this time double, because they had a double deprivation of liberty. So this one, but we all have to think in other measures and trying to think or to open the heads of politicians or social, or the ones that make the laws, that they have to think in other measures, open ones, and we have to look at the recidivism, that with these measures, we don't have this one, and with the incarceration, we have very bad results with the boys that have been incarcerated, and then these are the ones that are in the adults' prison.
Thank you so much, Judge Pascual. I'm going to skip across the Pacific Ocean to Indonesia, to Pak Slamet, to ask for your final thoughts.
Prior to the pandemic, the implementation of juvenile criminal system law since 2040 has resulted in one, shifting the paradigm from punitive justice to restorative justice. Second, increasing diversion rate from below 10% to about 50%. Three, reducing the percentage of cases with imprisonment sentencing from above 80% to less than 30%. Indonesia continues the strengthening restorative justice approach through criminal justice and correctional system, including emphasizing that the privation of liberty, including imprisonment in the last resort. The policy in release thought assimilation and integration as a response to the pandemic has actually hastened the reduction of juvenile in prisons. The measure reduced the number of children in prison by 42%. We acknowledge the challenges in ensuring rehabilitation and reintegration supports. We have adjusted the approaches, promoted participation of communities towards the engagement of community group on correctional affairs to support the rehabilitation and reintegration of juvenile to their families and communities. We aim in strengthening intersectoral cooperation, including in the adoption of the protocol of for release of juvenile during COVID-19 situation. The protocol and other collaboration will strengthen parenting, health services, and various innovation, including online supervision and monitoring that can fill the gap. If we continue to supplement these approaches to the traditional approaches, we hope it will strengthen and improve various serious services and approaches that have been provided since before. Based on the learning when this COVID-19 has passed, we are confident that we achieve that objective of better fulfilling the right and protecting children in contact with the law. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much, Pak Slamet, for sharing that experience of Indonesia and the impressive data. And we've also seen some impressive data in the US as well. Speaking of the US, let me go to Mike Dempsey. Mike, again, a difficult question, I know. But you know, what are your reflections, having such a bird's eye view across many different states in the US? What do you think we can do to make sure we don't lose some of the impressive gain?
Definitely a hard question. I've made an awful lot of notes, and we don't have time for me to go through them all. But I would probably, my biggest takeaways, one thing that I want CJJA to do is a response to all of these really positive changes and new policies, and what I guess I would call maybe even a new best normal for juvenile justice systems and caring for kids who are involved in the system, is to memorialize some of these changes through a second issue brief that is really focused on identifying these new practices and approaches that have occurred as a result of the pandemic, and making sure that we work not to just identify them, but to maintain them in our everyday practices. And you know, a lot of this really does stem around some of the basic concepts that many systems here in the United States have been focused on for several years, and that is making sure that we are working hard to identify the right kids and making sure that they are receiving the right kinds of services for the right amount of time in the right place. And many times, I think probably all systems need to do a better job of identifying those kids who could be better served in less restrictive settings than what we do now. And I think that is part of what this pandemic has caused many systems to really take a close look at, is identifying those kids who could be better served in alternative settings as opposed to being placed in secure settings or correctional style facilities. So I think is probably the most important outcome from all of this. As well, along with that is just the heightened awareness and focus on the length of stay for kids who are placed in committed facilities. And just real quickly, one of the things that I've also recognized throughout this process is this increased awareness around the relationships between staff and kids, and staff, kids, and their families, and this increased family engagement strategies and the technology that we can use to increase those types of activities. And we have to recognize that those relationships are important, and they need to be built in very positive ways in order to have a positive impact on the continued development of the kids who are entrusted to our care. So I think those are some of my main takeaways.
I'm now going to hand over to Anne-Catherine in Switzerland for your final reflections. Over to you, Anne-Catherine.
Thank you. Well, as I mentioned at the beginning, for me as a prosecutor, I think what I learned out of this period was that really the experience that detention, pretrial detention, has to be questioned, and it showed that it wasn't needed in many of the cases. So this is one thing that I will keep for myself. From the feedbacks that I got from other institutions, I can say that this pandemic has brought a lot of good experiences that I think will be keeping going on. So for example, as far as the contact of juveniles in institutions or unaccompanied minor asylum seekers with their officials, like their legal advisors, contact persons, or even judges, were faster and easier through the video conference. So it was faster for them to get in contact with them. They didn't have to wait for an appointment or travel to their offices. And I think this is a positive aspect of this new way of communication due to the impossibility of having a physical contact. So I hope that this experience will keep on going. On the other side, I had a very good feedback from an education facility because they told me that the pandemic forced them to question their system that they have been practicing up to now. So they tried to extend the participation of the juveniles by letting them make suggestions about how their stay in the institution should be organized. For example, in respect of use of mobile homes, activities, visits from family members, and these kind of things. The juveniles were also motivated to watch the news and follow what decisions the government would take and why. And they were afterwards also discussed in the group. So as we all know, information is essential to be able to participate in decision making. And I think this experience on one side for the children, but also for the institutions, was very important and was very positive. Therefore, I'm happy to say that the experience of the COVID-19 pandemic in this institution brought a big change to the participation rights of their juveniles, and I'm really happy. And I'm personally sure that similar experiences have been made in many other institutions due to the fact that everyone had to face the fact that nothing is like it was before. And I think this will be the future for everyone.
Thank you so much, Anne-Catherine. And now, last but not least, Hernan, if we could hear your reflections.
Thank you. Yeah, I did start touching earlier, but I want to honor all of the people listening and tuning in who have been asking a bunch of questions, like BJ said. And I think one of the questions as I was scrolling through, which I want to reflect on more intentionally, is what do we do with the young people that we're releasing, right? Because If we really want to sustain the changes that we're currently talking about, then we need to actively think about the future. And if we're releasing young people, we do need to worry that some of them, without the proper supports, are going to be coming right back right at the end of this pandemic, right? And so I think part of what is an important takeaway for me from this conversation here in the US and globally is the immediate need to divest from prison-like settings and reinvest all of that into community-based support systems and really beefing up the communities that young people are currently in. For every young person that's being released back into the community, for some of the states here in the United States, you know, it costs close to $150,000 for one kid 1 year to up to $450,000 for one kid 1 year, depending on the state. Like Mike said, we have 50 states. All of them are very different in terms of how much money sort of is invested into a prison when a young person sets foot through that door. Can y'all imagine what we could do with $150,000 or $450,000 here in the US? I know for some countries that US dollar is worth so much more, but can you imagine what we could do here in the US, right? If we could divest from the prison mentality and invest into the community-based support mentality, it will really help us to really sustain all of this work. People have mentioned in the questions to parole, probation, the role that that plays, supervision, or how to really manage young people when they're released. You know, I think we need to train and really support people in the community to support their young people returning back to them, right? We shouldn't actively continue relying too much on systems to do the work that communities have the power and ability to do. I think we struggle with that, right? And I want to be very honest and cautious in saying that as I get older and as I remove myself further and further from my, quote, lived experience of having been in prison and get indoctrinated with all of this knowledge around systems and legal language and all of like the beautiful sort of experience that all of you bring to this table, I quickly and very sort of exponentially lose connection to the need for community sometimes. And I'm grounded in that by listening to young people all the time. And so that's the active thing that I also want people to take away from this conversation. You want to keep and sustain all of the stuff that we're doing right now. Work with the young people that are being released right now, not just in helping them get the resources they need, but to be active decision makers and people at the table that are guiding us into the future. You know, young people aren't just the case. They're not just the young person that went through that facility. They will one day be the future policymaker, the elected official, the president of some of these countries that we're, you know, representing here. These young people are the future. They are the potential. And if we really want to sustain all of these changes, then we need to be actively providing leadership opportunities for these young people, not just in the local conversation, but even globally right now. I think one important thing, and Vijay, you might kill me for saying this, right, but that UNICEF could do is really bring together a constellation of young people from different countries to really create a task force or a body that actively now is in charge of making sure that justice systems throughout the globe are doing right by not just them, but by their peers, and really supporting that infrastructure so that other young people have the opportunity to lead and help us adults. Because I turned 28 on May 20, y'all. I'm not that young anymore. And so I want to be very honest that I'm not the young person that I was at 16, but I am also not the young person who should be leading all of these conversations all the time anymore. There are bright minds who I get to work with at Youth First, and who I know exist maybe listening into this conversation right now and in other parts of the country, in other parts of the world. I keep getting stuck with the country and globe because I realize that we're in an international context, but thank you for the opportunity to be here. Again, beef up the community supports, listen to young people, create some overseeing accountability body for all the adults that are doing this work. I get it. We got titles, we got experience, we have decision-making power, but we need to share that decision-making power and the ability to think of a new future with the people who are going to be in that future, which are young people. So thank you, Vijay, for the opportunity to be here.
Well, thank you so much, Hernan, and a great summation and great advice going forward, and something that UNICEF absolutely would be very keen and committed to take forward, and that is children and young people in the justice system being the agents of change for the justice system. Absolutely. Well, ladies and gentlemen, folks from around the world, we have come to the end of this webinar. And I want to first pay tribute and immense thanks to all of our panelists, Pak Slamet from Indonesia, Judge Marta Pascual from Argentina, Mike Dempsey from here in the US, and Catherine Hatt from Switzerland, and of course, Hernan Carvente Martinez, also from the US. Thank you so much for all that you have shared. We have received many questions, and many chats. And to all of you who are listening, we are going to follow up on those questions that we haven't been able to answer by hopefully providing some written responses, as well as uploading the recording to this webinar for sharing. I'm also going to work with the panelists for any publications that they mentioned, or documents or examples, to also have the links available to all of you so that you can access them going forward. As I mentioned, we will be having another webinar on the 21st of May at the same time, looking at the courts and how they have remained, how to keep them operational for children and women during this pandemic. As we've heard from some of the speakers, the role of the courts in releasing children, but also in ensuring their protection and their rights during this pandemic is really important. We're also organizing both of these webinars to be held in French and in Spanish. So please join us for those, and we will share the invites. The composition of the speakers will be slightly different, but we will be having some of the speakers from today, and we'll send out an invite once those details are confirmed. So with that, I will bring the webinar to a conclusion. To all of you, have a lovely day, afternoon, evening, and take care of yourselves and be well.